This video is brought to you by the TLDR store. Support your favourite country, including both China and the US, by picking up a Countries with Shoes pin badge. And you can get a free random badge when you buy any two and use code CHINAUS. The link is in the description. Anyway, in this video, we're going to be taking another look at the big geopolitical question of our times, whether China can overtake the US. And in this video, we'll be taking a look at 3 reasons why China will overtake America. But before we get into it, the usual caveats apply. Firstly, before you jump down our throats about how blatantly pro-China and anti-US this video is for a nominally impartial channel, we did a 3 reasons why China won't overtake the US video a couple of weeks ago. So you can go and watch that video for balance. Secondly, this isn't intended as an exhaustive list. There are obviously more than 3 possible arguments here. These are just the 3 that we thought were most significant. Thirdly, by overtake, we mean overtake the US in terms of superpower status. What it means to be a superpower is difficult to define, and we're not going to try and give it a complete definition right now. Fourthly, and finally, we should say that we don't really want to be doing this sort of video. Ideally, the rise of China would be positive sum. It means a better world economy and a higher standard of well-being for most Chinese people, not a zero-sum, adversarial us versus them challenge to the US. Unfortunately though, that's the way that things are being framed, both in US politics, where basically the only thing that Democrats and Republicans can agree on is a need to contain China, and Chinese politics, where an increasingly nationalistic CCP spend most of their time testing the US. Anyway, let's get into the 3 reasons. And the 3 arguments we're going to look at are America's failing political system, America's isolationist turn, and the fragility of the US dollar. So let's start with America's failing political system. In recent history, many Western analysts have argued that a capitalistic liberal democracy is essentially the best political system and the natural endpoint for all societies. Democracies, the argument went, are better at making popular decisions and maintaining consent of the governed, as well as saying that free markets are the best way of growing an economy. In 1990, Francis Fukuyama famously predicted that the worldwide spread of liberal democracy and free market capitalism would mark the end of history. And while this idea might have been controversial but plausible in the 1990s, today it looks premature and naive. American democracy has none of the aforementioned advantages. Today, Washington is, well, bad at making decisions. Bipartisan consensus is increasingly rare, and Democrats and Republicans today spend more time than ever attacking one another for cheap political points at the expense of America. For a case in point, look at the recurrent debt ceiling showdowns. And even with the majority, Biden has struggled. His infrastructure bill took months of political infighting to pass, and even then, only in a watered-down form. Essentially, America's democratic processes have become cumbersome, petty, and ineffective. The CCP, on the other hand, can make large, complex decisions quickly, an ever more important advantage in a world where the rate of change is increasing. They can build a 1,700-kilometre railway at 3,000 metres above sea level for $50 billion, about 74 times cheaper per mile than a subway in New York. They can move over 1 million people out of the Three Gorges Dam floodplain to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe. They can even use the Chinese equivalent of TikTok to teach kids, with the CCP even limiting teens' access to the app to just 40 minutes a day, as well as pressuring the company to promote educational content including science experiments, museum exhibitions, and historical explainers. You might expect that with its endless checks and balances, stakeholder management and majoritarian requirements would at least better secure the consent of the governed. After all, who likes being forcibly displaced by the state or having their TikTok usage limited? But this just isn't the case. Americans don't trust their government at all, while the Chinese are apparently quite enamored by the CCP. Congress's approval rating sits at about 20%, and this doesn't look likely to improve anytime soon, because, rather confusingly, members of Congress still have a re-election rate of about 90%, despite being deeply unpopular. Thanks to an increasingly polarized political system, every 4 years, half of Americans end up deeply disappointed with a president they really don't like, sparking talk of secession. The Chinese, on the other hand, are pretty keen on their government. In 2016, the last time the Ash Center polled Chinese citizens, an astonishing 95.5% approved of their government. Now, these figures should be taken with a pinch of salt. The CCP are big on propaganda and coercion. But even taking those caveats into account, it's undeniable that the Chinese government is better at securing the consent of the governed than their democratic rivals across the Pacific, at least at the moment. All in all, the CCP's authoritarianism is both more decisive and more domestically popular than Washington's democracy. Alright, on to the second reason, America's isolationist pivot. Just about the only thing that Trump and Biden can agree on is that America's days as the world's police are over. Both resent carrying NATO, both wanted to get out of Afghanistan, and Trump even tried to reduce the US's footprint in Germany. After apparent failures in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Somalia, US intervention has become unpopular across the political aisle. Historically, being a superpower, whether it was the British Empire or post-World War II America, has involved being willing to fight in wars, something that the US no longer looks keen on. And this in turn reduces the strength of US alliances around the world, which were previously backed by the promise of US military support. And it forces America's allies, once dependent on the US for protection, to forge their own paths, sometimes away from America. This is most evident in the EU's newfound fascination with so-called strategic autonomy. And as the EU weans itself off US military support, it feels less obligated to support US geopolitical interests, which is why they're currently flirting with a new Chinese trade deal. You get the point. America's isolationist pivot weakens its alliances and hurts its superpower status. On to the last reason though, the fragility of the US dollar. Now, before we even get into this one, we should say the usual caveats do apply. We're not economists, and even economists disagree on how the dollar will fare in the future. But we thought this was worth including because there's at least an argument that the dollar is on the decline. Anyway, let's get into it. Essentially, since World War II, the US dollar has been the world's reserve currency, which basically means it's everyone's default currency. International loans are often denominated in dollars, financial markets are often based on US Treasury rates, and there's always an international demand for the currency. This has bestowed an exorbitant privilege on the US. They can borrow loads of money, buy imports in dollars, and then when it comes to paying them off, just print more money. This is why the US has been able to run up massive debts and a current account deficit without borrowing rates going up. Investors know that there'll always be demand for dollars because everyone uses them, and that the US can just print more if they need to. Unfortunately for the US though, the dollar's days as the world's reserve currency could be drawing to a close. Recent events have shown the world that inflation is still a real threat, and if inflation proves to be sticky, the US could be in trouble. Any interest rate increases triggered by inflation will dramatically increase the cost of servicing the US's already massive debt. And if they want to stop debt spiraling, US politicians will either have to raise taxes or cut spending. And given the state of American politics, this seems unlikely to happen. Essentially, a combination of inflationary pressures and fiscal irresponsibility on the part of American politicians could spell the end of the dollar's exorbitant privilege, gifting China another advantage in the Sino-American economic race. So those are the three reasons. And as a final thing, we should say that all of these reasons, including the three we mentioned in the first video, are all contingencies. None of them are guaranteed to happen, and no one knows the future. If anything, the main takeaway from these two videos should be that no one knows who the next superpower will be. Both China and the US have various Achilles heels. Who knows, it might end up being India, Nigeria, or another country that no one's even considering. Basically, don't stay up late worrying. The future is uncertain and no one knows, not least TLDR, a tiny YouTube channel. But what do you think? Is China going to come out on top and overtake the US? Or will America always be the dominant force in the world? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. As I said at the start of the video, for a limited time, if you order any 2 countries with shoes pin badges, then you can get a 3rd random pin absolutely free. It's as easy as that. Buy any 2 pins and get a 3rd one free. Don't like the random pin we send you? Then you can give it someone as a Christmas gift. Stick it on someone's backpack without telling them. Attach it to the sole of your shoe to give yourself an extra tap. It's up to you, but the store is linked below and the code is ChinaUS. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.